This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I want to start by apologising. There's at least someone in the audience that I heard may have come because they think David Olusoga is really good looking and they were hoping to meet him. I have had the pleasure of meeting him. I confirm he is really good looking and charming. But yeah, unfortunately right now he is apparently suffering from a fever and food poisoning, and he's also actually in the Caribbean. We were hoping he was going to record this paper as a video that we could show you. So I also apologise to that person for not telling them that in advance either. We were hoping that we would get his voice, but he has sent me his paper, which I'm going to do my best to present to you. I only got it late last night. That's part of one of the challenges of TV. The peculiar challenges of Black history that he puts in his title, they've got more and more peculiar on this paper anyway. So let me just, without further ado, get to what he wanted to say. So this paper is called Television, Radio and the Peculiar Challenges of Black History. It mostly focuses on television over radio. He says, the first thing I'd like to say is obvious, my apologies for not being there in person. However, I'd like to suggest the reasons for my physical absence today is reflective of good news. And therefore, you should all be really grateful that I'm not here. That's because I'm currently in the Caribbean, filming a new series on the economics of slavery and the story of the Slave Compensation Commission of 1834. If you want to know more about that, there are people from the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project here today, and there's some leaflets on the back table as well. He didn't write them, so it is. This two-part series for BBC Two will bring to the screen the work carried out by the Legacies of British Slave Ownership team under Catherine Hall and Nick Draper at UCL. That BBC Two is willing to invest in and broadcast, hopefully on prime time, a two-part series on slavery without an anniversary and without any of the other hooks that normally attract commissions, says something about where we are. It says something about the relationship between television and Black history that is what I'd like to talk about today, the confluence of those two, the difficult relationship between the industry I have spent most of my career working in and the branch of history about which I, like you, feel dedicated to. I should stress that I'm speaking to you today as a historian who seeks to write and research about histories that I find interesting and believe are important, namely the colonialism, slavery and histories of the 19th and 20th centuries, but also and primarily as a producer and more recently presenter who for 15 years made TV and radio programmes. I should explain that these are my own, so this is the usual BBC employee disclaimer. His views are not the views of the BBC. As is well known, there are a few Black and ethnic minority producers in British television, something about which the industry has of late lamented. There are fewer still who have specialised for almost all of their career in historical programming. Without meaning to suggest that my experiences are unique or uniquely valuable, they are viewpoints gained from a position between the two worlds, the world of history writing on one hand and the television industry on the other. I should stress that I'm not a scholar and I don't write in academic idiom. I'm primarily a journalist. I've come to understand more than I did when I began my career the potential power of the medium of television, and to a lesser extent radio, to inspire within others the same passion for the past. It was broadcast television history, more than stilted lessons I had at school, that made me care about the past and the people of the past. It was the documentaries that appeared on BBC Two during my childhood that brought the past to life for me in a way that was mesmerising and utterly appealing. Anyone who seriously aspires, now this is where we get our crib sheet on how to get your subject on TV. Anyone who aspires to see their field of history taken out to the wider world needs to understand that television is their greatest potential ally. The publishers know this. They fall over one another to commission books that are based on television series. They know they will sell better and bring people into the bookshops who would otherwise not dream of buying a history book. Television history not only draws people in their millions into bookshops, it also draws in great numbers to stately homes, cathedrals, museums, battlefields and other sites of British history. The National Trust know this, English Heritage know this, and every curator of every historic site in Britain is well aware of it. Television is a uniquely powerful medium. It is personal as well as public. It inspires the individual to discover new individual passions, but also to feel part of the wider national public story. But television is also an industry with its own doors, a subculture, a culture which developed over the past 90 years. That culture, like the culture of academia, is difficult to navigate within or understand from outside. It is also constantly changing. And the culture of television is in part a reflection of the sorts of people and the demographic groups who have dominated that industry. My aim here is not to decry the failings, well documented and well understood that they are, of television to be accurately reflective of British society. My aim is to be practical and to encourage those of us who care about Black British history to think about how we might better harness this wonderful medium. So in his next section, he talks about the technical challenges, particularly the tyranny of picture in television. So he says, television is a demanding and difficult media. The tyranny of picture, the cost of locations, the centrality of narrative, and the need to attract mass audiences all pose challenges for Black history, a subject area, and even a phrase that can allegedly be off-putting to white audiences. But one of those things we think we know is that for TV, the picture really is central. But it really is more than you might think. Many of the reasons as to why one idea has potential to work on TV and another, equally interesting and important story, does not, is not always obvious. Here's one simple example. Why is the story of Frances Barber more TV-friendly than the story of Mary Prince? Well, for two reasons. Barber is associated with a figure the audience has heard of, and we have a portrait of him. That might be disputed now, but anyway, one story is sellable, potentially the other would struggle. TV producers think in these terms. We know the audience wants to look at the face of someone they are learning about. Which is why I just tried to get this up here. Anyway, reconstruction is artifice, and they know that and only accept it under certain circumstances. Here's another effect of the tyranny of the picture. One of the reasons for television's propensity to regurgitate the Windrush myth, the idea that Black people only really took part in British life after 1948, is because that event and the following years are so well recorded in film and photography. The presence of Black people further back in British history is a far more difficult proposition for a producer and a commissioner because of the lack of portraits, visual representations of the people being discussed. So this is again a clarion call to all of anyone who has those pictures, send them to the BBC. But if by some happy accident a cycle of portraits of Black Elizabethans were discovered in some attic in Stratford-upon-Avon or Suffolk, oh, happy days. Television producer commissioners and the channels would fall over one another to commission and broadcast a programme focused around that visual material. These examples show how television accidentally reinforces misunderstandings of the past that historians are keen to challenge and overturn. It's not that we don't get that there were Black people in Britain before 1948, it's just that we don't see enough of them in the frame and on canvas. Of course, they are there in greater numbers than most TV producers know, and that is where historians need to be pushy. Delighted at the invitation. Anyway, so part two on cultural challenges, the challenges of that culture of audiences. And in this section, he really puts across an argument that's kind of been implicit today already, is between representation versus story. Why are we doing this? Are we doing it because we want to represent a history or because there's a really interesting story to be told? Hopefully both. But anyway, the greatest challenge to Black history on TV is not technical but cultural. There has been a reasonably large amount of Black history on TV and radio historically, but much of it has failed to win an audience among both Black and white viewers. That is depressing, but true. Black people have not watched in large numbers, and white people have often felt that the programmes were not aimed at them. My very personal view as to why these often very accomplished series of films have not won a large audience is not one that is widely held. I feel we've failed because we have made and commissioned these films out of a sense of worthiness and allowed a culture of representation and inclusion to too often overwhelm the narrative, the visual, and the structural demands of television as a medium. Television at its core is about audiences. Programmes that fail to get audiences are deemed, in economic and in public service terms, to have failed. This is true of many of my own projects, and I think this is right. No project, no matter how good, can be said to have been a success if it failed to bring to the subject people who otherwise might not have felt it was for them by connecting to that wide audience. Sometimes TV should fail this test, and there are films we should make and do make because they are important. The commissioners know they will not get a big audience, but I think we have sometimes accepted that lowering of expectations and not tried greatly. I could name films, my own again among them, and the work of people I admire that falls into this category, but that would not be productive. So to go back to reasons for the problems. In TV, we have also historically allowed Black history to become a separate strand of broadcasting. One of the things people lament is that there used to be a diversity commissioner at Channel 4 and strands for Black history on the BBC and at Channel 4. And when they went, it seems clear that the amount of Black history on TV fell. However, I'm glad that both the strands were cancelled and the commissioners not replaced. Because although we had more Black history, it was so firmly ghettoised as to make it invisible to mainstream audiences. And because those strands gave other commissioners, history, arts, etc., the excuse not to commission in their genre. I lament the fall in Black history, but hope we're on the road to reversing that trend and doing so in mainstream and at prime time. Historically, far too many programmes have been overly inclusive when one ethnic group's role in a narrative has been less than compelling. Out of a sense of inclusion, we have suspended the ruthlessness of narrative. In my view, these rules of representation, along with much of the focus on language that are a necessary part of academic history, have to be suspended when it comes to television. I shall use the example of the last series I made for the BBC to discuss some of the opportunities and some of the pitfalls around Black history. The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire was a two-part series commissioned by the BBC, broadcast on BBC Two during August 2014. A part of the BBC's centenary programme for the anniversary of the First World War. Both programmes succeeded in winning an audience of over 1 million, an audience figure that was boosted by viewing on iPlayer in the weeks that followed. These figures are about average for the slot at that time of year, though by no means high. The series attempted to put the world back in World War I. I think most of us have probably seen it, or you can see it, so I'm not going to go into the description of that. But it says, I began the series with full knowledge that the way to make it critically successful and draw an audience involved an approach, a structure, and a story selection that would be the exact opposite of what would be approved of by parts of the Black press. The series set out to put story first, select stories based on how they work together, on how they took the film to dramatic locations, and on the basis of what would be most resonant and surprising to a mainstream audience. What it did not do was feel that it was paramount that each of the major ethnic groups in the UK had to have their stories of their ancestors' role in the war told in a dutiful way, as if in some box-ticking exercise. While the British African populations were mentioned in passing, their stories were not put centre stage when exploring the war in Africa. The story of the 16,000... he then describes what he does do in the programme. The reaction from bloggers and commentaries within the Black British community, if there is such a uniform thing, was exactly what I suspected. The series was condemned for not having gone through the ethnic groups resident in the UK today and told the stories of their ancestors. Some of the comments made to the BBC Complaints Department and on social media accused the series of being inaccurate for not having spent more time on the West Indian regiments, although numerically they were a tiny force within the 4 million non-white combatants and auxiliaries. One commentator with no experience of making TV said that we should have done exactly that. What was unsaid and what was left unexamined was the presumption that Black history on TV exists to carry the task of representation, and that all technical, journalistic and audience research-based considerations should be suspended. It is this thinking that has undermined Black history on TV. It acts as a powerful limitation on the appeal of Black history to both commissioners and audiences. So long as the burden of inclusivity overwhelms the demand of story and the requirements of the medium, Black history will remain a marginal aspect of the schedules, commissioned out of a sense of duty and with little enthusiasm or expectation of a wide audience. And I say this not to induce pity for myself as a filmmaker in an enviable position, neither do I think that television should be shielded from criticism, And when compared to the culture of book reviews, the reviewing of television is often gentle and mild-mannered. I use this example because it's really emblematic of what I'm trying to say. The key, in my view, to getting more black historical figures and stories onto British TV is to stop regarding representation as the prime role of black history programmes. That should be an ancillary effect. The primary role of black history films should be to tell great stories in compelling ways, to appeal to and to surprise audiences. Those sorts of projects have a far greater chance of getting commissioned. We have in the past too often pushed for commissions by appealing to representation and inclusivity rather than what really excites commissioners, who are, after all, journalists with story and narrative and character and revelation hardwired into their mindsets. If we pitch worthy films, we will get worthy TV with low viewing figures. But more than this, we will never do justice to black history, which is global, epic, tragic, and full of great forces that have shaped our world. So just to sum up, he's saying, this is really kind of a query to how do you get your research on TV? So he says, let me appeal to academics and community leaders who care about black history to do two things. The first is to remember that television is a medium that is dominated by story and narrative. Any programme that attempts to allow other forces to dominate will produce programmes that will be unwatchable. Every television producer can tell you a long list of sequences, stories, programmes, etc. that were filmed but not used because they were unable to shepherd them over the hurdles of narrative and story structure. Secondly, television lives under the relentless tyranny of the picture. The best way to bring a story from black history to the screen is to think like a television producer and submit and surrender to the tyranny of the picture. I say this not in order to ask for special pleading, but to plead with historians to go back to the archive, as we hear that we definitely are doing, go back to the archives and think about what photographs, portrait collections, art galleries there might be that would arm sympathetic producers in their conversations with commissioners. Perhaps most importantly and finally, I would say that for the time being, it's unlikely that we will see a return to the days when commissioners from mainstream channels would be willing to commission programmes that do not appeal or seek to appeal to a mainstream audience. The days of ethnic minority commissioners whose jobs is to focus on viewing figures for minority audiences are over. Every programme needs to seek out a large audience. No channel, even if it's a niche channel, is willing to forego the potential of a large audience. What he's saying, to conclude, he's saying he's asking for a more sophisticated understanding of the power and limitations of television, which he feels is currently lacking amongst many of those who write about or immerse themselves in black history. I'm trying to. He actually sort of uses the example of Henry Louis Gates in America, who has become a cultural entrepreneur, carving out a special space built very much in his own shape, straddling the academy and the TV studio. He initiates his own television projects, he goes to channels with ideas and they get commissioned. He says, sadly, America has a flourishing black academy but lacks the tradition of television history, whereas the UK has a strong TV history tradition but lacks a vocal and powerful black academy, despite the efforts of many of the people here today. So I think, again, this is a kind of clarion call to rethink the way that how our research can translate onto television and try, each medium has its own challenges, but I'll stop there. But if anyone wants to read more about it, or I'm sure, I know that David's actually ill at the moment. We tried to get him on Twitter for questions, but I'm sure he'll be open to continuing the conversation with us in the future, and hopefully he'll be able to come to one of our future events.
Thank you very much, Miranda.